Welcome everyone to our insightful discussion on making sense of the Union budget. The annual budget is a crucial document that outlines the government's financial plans and priorities for the coming year, impacting everything from taxation and spending to various sectors of our economy. This evening, we will delve into key announcements, analyze their potential implications, and discuss how they might affect businesses, individuals, and the nation. I now invite Professor Sebastian, Chair of the Center for Public Policy and Governance, and Senior Professor, General Management and Public Policy area, to share his insights about the Union budget. I also invite Professor Kingshuk, Sarkar, Chair of General Management and Public Policy area, to moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Krishna, for introducing the topic. I welcome all the participants, both online and offline. This is a discussion about the Union budget that is presented today. Without much ado, I go into it. My first question, Professor Moderator, what is your broad overall general perception of the budget? Like whether it is a reach towards Kingshuk or it is another resource. If you can broadly give a word for to start with, then the overall flow of the event would be that there would be a conversation between me and Professor Morris for around 30 to 35 minutes. Then we will open it for the audience to ask questions. So the first thing that I do is that the broad perception is the or whether it is again another operation.
Well, let me do it like this. Let me take you through some of the measures and then make the comment. But a quick answer is that, look, the budget has only projected a growth of around 6.37%, which is kind of inadequate to reach the, Viksit Bharat targets, because that would require at least 7.5%. That's quite obvious. But let me just go through some of the, my core reactions to the budget, and then, I'll pick up that in greater detail. Okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
okay, you will present.
Yeah. So, if you really look, there are lots of digitization, credit initiatives, a lot of supply side initiatives, including organizational. Skilling is a theme that runs right through. Many buzzwords, the environment. There is, if you really, kind of get into it, a lot of tokenism. When I say tokenism, what I mean is they have been repeated or carried over from the previous budgets, previous statements, kind of pet good words, but no commentary on previous provisions and non-spending or the kind of the fallback in spending previous budgets. Okay. Now, and all these have implications for growth. So, underspending of the budget in various ways is perhaps the kind of core aspect of the Modi years. So this has been a constant feature in many of the budgets that have come. So the underspending, I think, is quite significant. Okay? And I'll come to that in a moment when I bring out the underspending. So targets may not be, so this raises a question, where are these spending targets really intended, or are there, really solid resistances which stand in the way of realizing those spending? Because, the problem with most governments is that they tend to overspend. But here is a government which, except on one or two items, has actually underspent. Growth is, as I said, quite inadequate. The claim that we may have clawed back to the pre-COVID trend is actually not correct. Okay? There is a kind of mistake which the economic survey makes, and makes this claim that we have actually clawed back to the trend line from the pre-COVID years. Okay? Employment is a very major issue. The unemployment or the employment growth or the level of employment has been quite problematic. Unemployment doesn't seem to be because the labor force participation kind of adjusts itself. Okay? The measures on agriculture, labor, employment, MSMEs are absent actually, and whatever is mentioned there are really of the kind which is tinkering around. Private GCF, the good point is that if you look at the data, private GCF has begun to recover, but I'm not so sure that the trend will be maintained. Today it's about 26% of GDP, which is much better than most of the Modi years in which it was around 23% or under that. Okay. But today we are in an environment where the uncertainties have to tussle with the PLI, and the net impact is, just marginally positive. But if you look at the manufacturing sector, there doesn't seem to be much recovery. Okay. Yeah. So So should I go ahead or is okay? So okay, if I'm brought over, yeah, will be going okay. Yeah. So yeah. So let me just kind of yeah. So these are my comments, and before I come to the detailed comments, agriculture and yeah. So here is a graph which tells you, what the level of recovery has been. So just let me run through it. I can't see it. Yeah. So here is a graph which tells us. Now, as you can see, infrastructure has recovered, but most of the others have not. Manufacturing has not. IIP General has crossed the level pre-COVID, but has not got onto the trend line. Okay, consumer durables have not, and it's only the infrastructure which has gone back. Okay. Now, go on to the next graph. Now, here you'll see. Yeah, so here is the investment ratio, private, this is the total investment ratio. And you can see that the gross capital formation rate is still hovering around 30-31%. Okay. And during the high growth period, it had reached something in the range of around 34-35%. And if you do it correctly, probably about 36-37%. Okay. So it's still hovering around 31, but it has certainly recovered from the lows of the COVID period. But it's again begun to kind of plateau off. Okay. Now, if you look at investment projects outstanding, the growth rate is very low. Okay, which is the next slide. So the investment projects, look at the slope of these lines. So these will tell you that it's not on any kind of very high growth picture, which is growth rate, which is what would be required for Viksit Bharat. But it's slow. It will give you certainly a growth rate of around 5-6%. Okay. Yeah. Now look at the imports and exports. There is, of course, recovery from the period, and here you can see it on a kind of scale, but there is not really much. When you look at it on a log scale, and remember on a log scale, the slope of the line, broad slope, will give you the growth rate. So the Modi years were zero growth on exports, and there was a pickup after the COVID, but then it has again stagnated. Okay. Then when you look at the investments, this is the point, the gross capital formation, which I've already showed you. Now this is the investment ratio based on the spliced series, okay, GCF to GDP, okay, and that has not gone up. Sorry, there is a mistake here. These are the growth of exports of drugs, cotton manufacturers, and motor vehicles. Now it's only the drugs which have shown a very significant increase, thanks to the positive environment. But if you look at cotton and motor vehicles, it has not gone up. Okay, so that's again some positive and some negative. Now go on to the next picture, which is again on a log scale, the sales of cars, two-wheelers, and commercial vehicles and tractors. Okay. Now, again, you can see that there is no recovery after the COVID. In fact, in some sectors, it's actually declined. But let's say that it has reached the level, but not the trend line in the of the growth that was there pre-COVID. Okay. Yeah. Now, then when you look at cement and steel, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I think here is cement and two kinds of steel, finished steel and consumption and finished steel production. But if you look at cement, okay, again, cement has gone up, it has clawed back to the trend line, and this is positive, largely spurred by the demand created by government spending. Okay. However, steel has just about crossed the level pre-COVID, but it has still not clawed back to the trend line which you can project from the pre-COVID days. Okay. So yeah, now here is something which is actually interesting. Okay. If you look at the expenditure, government expenditure ratio, that means the government expenditure to the GDP, and here we have to take the moving average to remove the fluctuations. You can see that the government expenditure ratios, they went up during the COVID crisis, as was expected. They have come down and they are moving down. Okay. So the capital expenditure as a proportion of total government expenditure was one of the high points of this government strategy. That means they claim that the capital expenditure proportion of total expenditure of government is being focused. Now that has indeed happened. So the capital expenditure ratio rose from around 12%, 13% to around 20% of overall expenditure, which I think is very good. However, that has begun to come down over the last budget, and certainly it will come down in this budget if the allocations are going to be an indication. Yeah. Now, here is the main point which so many people miss, okay, which is the LFPR, the labor force participation rate, and the employment rate and the unemployment rate. Yes, the unemployment rate is not too high; it's around 8%. But if you look at the labor force participation rate, that has come down, and more importantly, the total employment, the absolute levels of employment has also come down. Okay, so the unemployment rate has also the employment rate has also come down. Okay? There is some debate between the CMI figures and this and the government figures. I've used the CMI figures because they're more reliable. Now, this has happened at a time when the rural wages, real wages, have actually not shown any change at all. And if you look at the employment, okay, the employment and absolute numbers has also come down. So this is the major problem with the recovery from the COVID. Okay. Now, yeah, so I will skip this unless we want to look at that. So here is a certain analysis which looks at the underspending of the government. Okay. So now, when you look at those which are in red, okay, you can see that the proposed growth in the previous budget is given in the second column, okay, and what has been realized is given in the second column. So in all these items, there has been underspending, and the underspending is from the budget to the realized is given in the first column. So the proposed growth and the realized growth difference are there. So it raises a big question of the current budget, which is akin to a proposed growth in spending. Would it be realized? Because every year prior, at least the last 2 years prior, post-COVID, the budget has always been spent. Of course, the positive point is that the fiscal deficit targets were more than realized. Okay, but I would think at great cost to employment and growth. Okay. So this is where I will kind of take a pause and wait for Kingshuk. You can basically.
Even if you have the budget being there was a lot of talk and competition to income tax exemption, tax. Actually, 12.75 would include standard deductions. So, how far this will boost consumption? Like the objective was to boost consumption of the middle class, but how it will impact the consumption, because last few years consumption is going down. What is your opinion on that?
Well, there is no need to split hairs or anything. The exemption limit is quite significant. Okay. So many in that bracket will stand to gain between 40,000 rupees to about a lakh in terms of lower taxes. And that will certainly have an impact on consumer durables, which are of value, which are of immediate purchase value. People in this income group. So I would think it would give to a declining situation. Movies, and such other products that certainly happen. And it's possible, but we have been given more with a motivation to not alienate the middle class. Because remember, before the budget, there was a huge ULI in social media led by the middle classes of excessive taxation, which kind of caricatured our dear finance minister as the person who's willing to snatch every savings that they have. Yeah, so it may have been motivated by, of course, the desire to keep the middle class on the right side, and I think that's important because the middle class kind of pulls in, throws a weight much greater than
the
its
setbacks of the last election also.
Yeah, may have been the issue, but it has been certainly positive. Yeah.
So another thing is that so far, even though it has been gradually being phased out, we have this concept of tax incentivized savings. Like to save tax, you may invest in certain equity, not equity, certain bonds and other instruments, which over the years gone down. Now this is almost over. Like the tax process is being simplified in a manner. So what happens to tax incentivized savings? Are there not like
the point is yes, but there is a lot of let's say misunderstanding about what helps overall savings. Okay, see, overall savings will go up when the growth improves because there is always a consumption lag. So if the growth can happen through vast government and private investments, exports, etc., growth can happen, then the savings will rise faster than the consumption would, and because there is always a lag on consumption. So the biggest determinant of the aggregate volume of savings is the GDP per se, and of course the growth. Okay. Now the interest rates do matter, but they matter in terms of channelizing savings into the financial side. Today, of course, a lot of the savings is anyway in the financial side, and therefore the rates matter. But they would, my sense is, push the savings into an X instrument versus a Y instrument, and not really, hurt that savings, overall savings. Yeah, some segments would be badly hurt. Yeah.
Another thing is that those who are getting relief are already in the tax bracket, but there are very large number. Majority of our population is not in the tax bracket, particularly income tax. They do pay indirect taxes.
Yeah.
So how much then are we overestimating the consumption impact of tax exemption in the income direct taxation? Because a lot, like, it is not going to touch majority of our population. But
there my answer would be somewhat different. See, a large part of our population is at such low levels of income that they've just gone past subsistence. They've certainly gone past subsistence. Though there are still maybe as many as 20% in Bihar who may be just about subsistence. But the majority elsewhere in the country may have gone past subsistence. So for all of them,
In fact, a good dividing line would be whether or not a family has a two-wheeler. So if a family has a two-wheeler, it's not become rich, but it has gone past subsistence. It doesn't have a two-wheeler, then it has still in the subsistence. Now also recognize that India's per head consumption of cereals and calories and protein and so on, for a variety of reasons, but largely because income is low, is actually very, very low compared to most other places. So without high growth, nothing can be done to these people. To say that I will shift some income in their favor, if that does not result in growth, is not going to be the way forward. So we need high growth. Therefore, I'd come back and say that, look, are our measures kind of maximizing the growth potential, the growth of the economy? I mean, is it addressing the potential of the economy to grow very high? So we saw that there were periods, often, I mean, some of them went as long as 7 years, okay, where we had growth in excess of 8.5%. Okay, and so the point is to get back to high growth. And this government talks about high growth, talks about the Vikasit Bharat and all that. But the point is, when it comes to managing the demand side and managing the overall atmosphere, it is doing things which are not engendering high growth.
And it keeps on going back to the supply side.
It keeps repeatedly going back to the supply side. It does not have a fundamental understanding of how the demand side is. If you leave it to civil servants entirely and politicians, this is what would happen. But you need proper economists. And that, unfortunately, so the demand side doesn't seem to come, whatever the reason. The demand side doesn't seem to come through. And I think the demand side is the biggest problem for a country like India. Because the entrepreneurship, the capitalist class, foreign direct investments, all of them are ready to take off if actually the demand can speed up. Okay.
But this income tax reform is welcome, but thing is that it is not touching majority of the population.
Oh, undoubtedly.
And the MPC of the lower segment of the population is much higher than those who are already paying taxes.
Yes. So therefore, the load on indirect taxes is much higher.
Much higher. And GST over the years is becoming more complex.
Oh, undoubtedly. See, again, GST has become very complex, and that may be one of the issues that we have. Sure.
Another thing apparently in the budget, it is there that there is a push on a public-private partnership kind of thing, particularly with respect to infrastructure. And government seeks to encourage India Incorporated to start spending more on infrastructure projects and speedier implementation of the PPP projects. There is an urban challenge fund worth rupees 1 lakh crore outlay is there, and for cities as growth hubs. So given your expertise on infrastructure and being the editor of India Infrastructure Report, your take on this particular thing, this push on PPP again.
Okay. See, the point is the push on PPPs is fundamentally right. Okay, for two reasons. One is that you need to bring in the efficiencies of the private sector, and the other is that the government finds it very difficult, or it doesn't want to improve the performance of the public sector. And I mean not just the public enterprises, but of the government sector. However, where PPPs can work is going to be very important. There are areas where if you push for PPPs, you'll get bad results. For instance, in healthcare, in education, in all areas, where there's a quality issue, and the quality is what drives the market failure. It's not a good idea to have PPPs. They would be very complex. Even if ex ante, they have to get it right. So, however, the government is completely oblivious of sectoral and such other reasons. And yeah, so however, the government is oblivious of which sectors to promote and so on. It did a good job when Gajendra Haldia used to be there in the planning commission, and you had the IDFC kind of crafting solutions for private investment. Those were the hoary days of PPPs, and quite a few good PPPs actually happened, including I think in the roads, also in ports, and so on. then it fell into a problem. The problem was that you had the global crisis and the response to that through high interest rates. So that kind of screwed up many of the PPPs. Some of them were good, but they were only facing a high interest rate. But many were badly designed as well, and therefore they did badly. Now, what the government did is, in some sectors, it could respond. For instance, in roads, it came out with its own investments, which were not too off the cuff in terms of efficiency or direction. But in most of the others, it could not. And the infrastructure spending kind of fell back. And it had to tweak many of the PPPs or many of the policies for PPPs to favor the private sector, favor in the sense for the private sector to make rents. Okay? And of course, a few business groups benefited greatly out of this. Okay? For instance, airports privatization, PPP models were tweaked, port models were tweaked, and so on. And this was very bad because what it does is it kind of creates cronies within the infrastructure space, and so on, which is not a good thing. The urban challenge, that means PPPs for the urban sector remain as dismal as before. There's practically nobody in government which wants to think through and come out with model concession agreements or with institutional mechanisms to push this forward. I have been arguing, as much as many of the others, that there is a need for a PPP India. That means an institution which has participation from government, from the private sector, from financial institutions, and from academia and professionals, which is completely not beholden to anyone, completely autonomous, which can then mull over this problem of how do I design appropriate contracting and PPP mechanisms. Okay? Without that, to talk about PPPs is to talk either about giving up on creating rent opportunities, or simply keep talking about it ad nauseum, because we have been saying this for the past at least now 10 years.
Again, the focus is on PPP based in on city areas.
No, let's take one good example. You talked about urban. If you look at smart cities, something close to a few lakh crores of rupees, I forget, have been spent. But the results have not just been not positive, but they have been negative. The sheer pain that cities have gone through because of the smart cities, the absurd design and the absurd management of smart cities is something which everybody can see.
Panjim is an example.
Well, Panjim is one example, but Pune is another, and so on. And I would still like to see where the smart cities have really worked, because it was completely topsy-turvy. It was entirely based on a cut and paste of smart cities, initiatives which had come in the Western world.
Going back to the issue that you raised during your presentation, is underspending, like particularly in the social sectors like healthcare, education, rural development, and like this government's obsession regarding fiscal prudence, like conservatism, like keeping the fiscal deficit, like last year it was 4.8, this year 4.4. So given the context that India is in, so such fiscal conservatism is going to work towards, if our goal is to grow much higher at much higher level, suppose 7.5 to 8%. It's this kind of, because we have unutilized resources, both human and non-human. Yeah. In such a context, this much of fiscal prudence, is it warranted, or what is your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Okay. And I have a certain view on that. Yes, after the COVID crisis, a certain trajectory for the fiscal deficit is necessary, but it can't just be for the fiscal deficit. It has to be for expenditures and revenue as well. Okay. And it has to be also sectoral. And all of it must not constrain growth. So you could have, let's say, a fiscal deficit of 4% on a GDP growth trajectory of 8%, and a fiscal growth of 4%, a fiscal deficit of 4% on a trajectory of maybe 6% or 5%. Obviously, you're going to choose the first one. But in order to be able to choose the first one, you have to be sensitive to the demand side.
Yes.
And the higher elasticities that some of the sectors bring. For instance, if automobiles can grow faster, and for that you create demand side push. For instance, particularly scooters and consumer durables and some of the items which the people above the people who have kind of reached the bottom of the middle class are going to spend on. Okay, then yes, you can actually do a job of not being conservative the way an accountant would be. Okay, and instead approach the problem as an economist. So the problem with the government of India is there's essentially an accountant's framework. It does not have the macroeconomic framework where there is a denominator also to be worried about.
And also the crucial thing is that where this under expenditure is happening.
Yeah. See,
the areas are very, very quite. There is a pattern where the
yes. So there is quite a pattern actually, but for instance, in education, the overall increase in expenditure last year was supposed to be 1.83 proposed growth in expenditures, but what was realized was minus 7.85, a clear difference of 2 plus 8, which is 10%. Now, that's huge. Okay. Similarly, on food, okay, the proposal was for minus 3.5. That means a reduction because these are subsidies, but the reduction was much higher, minus 7. Okay, on education, the proposal was for an increase of 1.83, but the reduction was, as I said, 8. Okay, so I can go on to other areas as well. So let's say now, I think that is what I showed you, right?
You can make
okay
slide.
Yeah. So now look at rural development, scientific.
Minus 30.
Yeah. So all over here there has been underspending, and under realization. So rural development, scientific, social welfare, urban development, others. Okay, and let's say for food. Development of Northeast, education.
Keep on talking development Northeast, it is minus 30.
Yeah, and so on. Yes, because that we have been talking about for the last. Of course, this year we can forgive the government because there has been a kind of a crisis in the Northeast, but not in much of it. Actually, if you take a population weight, it's only in one small place where there's this conflict. Yeah, so
petroleum it is a huge over expenditure.
That's right. Petroleum is a whole huge over expenditure. I really don't know why, but I guess it has to do with this green push and so on. Pension, of course, is something which you can't calculate. Yeah, I mean, you can't make the kind of assumption which the government has made. The pressure from government employees itself would be very high, and so on. So my point is, that education, development of the Northeast, food, and of course, the next one, which is rural development, social welfare, and these, and particularly urban, are extraordinarily important for driving India's growth. Because here is where the small push in terms of reforms and some spending and corrections can bring forth a lot of pent-up.
Here lies the demand side intervention.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And the government, and now these spendings are not being realized or they're underdone for 2 reasons, rather 3 reasons. One is in areas like rural development and so on, there is probably no intent because the DNA of this government is that let's not worry much about MNREGS. MNREGS, the rates, the total allocations remain the same, 86,000 crores, and many states.
Demand is growing.
Demand is there because you can see that with such heavy, effective unemployment, the demand should be. Okay? The government's contention is that the demand is not. But if you look at West Bengal and some of the other governments, they've said, hey, you haven't even paid us the back. Okay? So the point is that MNREGS is against the DNA of the government, understandably so. But then the government does not have any, reform-based huge increase in spending which can do things better than the MNREGS. So 2 things are involved here. One is well-being, because Indian population are not just poor, but they are very unhealthy. The other is, of course, creating the demand side, which is
this almost stagnant allocation to MG Narega kind of a thing. At the same time, people are suffering because of food inflation. So if you like, inflation rate is not that high, but if you take food inflation separately, it is quite. So I don't think there is much in the budget that addresses the issue of food inflation. What do you think?
See, the point there is I may not agree too much with this. Okay. See, how do you handle food inflation is an important issue. Unfortunately, both the media, the RBI, and the government handles the food inflation by worrying too much about it and doing things which may retard it. For instance, the RBI is very sensitive to inflation and has irrationally picked up what I call the headline inflation as its target. No central bank can actually control headline inflation because a significant part of that is food and fuel inflation, over which the RBI is no control. It should have targeted core. So the core is already as low as the 4%. About 3.5% or lower. In fact, the budget has projected a core of 3.7% inflation. So the inflation is not so much the issue. That's what I would think. And there is an easy way out for the government, which if you look at many of the Southeast Asian countries, they did this. You need to have a universal rationing by which every family has a card, so that if the price of a certain food, let's say an important food like a dal, goes skyrocketing, they get a minimum quantity at an official price. Because the point about food is the price elasticities are what they are. So if there is a 5% shortfall, the price can rise by 50%. Okay. But if a 5% shortfall is equally distributed amongst all as equal humans, okay, so you need not worry about it. So China, during its heady growth, could tolerate a food inflation for 6 years in the range of around 20 to 25%. Okay. But what the government does is the moment it sees an inflation and the RBI, it tightens interest rates. And here I have sympathy with the government. And I would think that the RBI should actually lower interest rates. The government is right. Okay. Because hopefully that will add one more kick to the private investment.
But that impinges RBI's autonomy also.
No, I'm not saying the government should force, but I think the RBI should rethink this. The other point is that if you look at the basket which is driving India's inflation data, it's just too much on the food side. Now that basket is good for the poor. It reflects there. It reflects the average individual. It does not reflect average consumption. It's not consumption weighted, it's only person weighted. And therefore, it's hugely off the line from the point of view of macroeconomic policy. So we are literally dancing to tomato and let us say poor dal price and onion prices.
Edible oil.
Yes, that has created a huge uncertainty in the financial markets. So my view is different. But in general, yes, I mean, inflation is very, very important. There is no way to control, let us say, food inflation if you want to pursue high growth other than through a universal rationing system. And the universal rationing system can also be preferentially activated to help those who are really needy, okay? Very poor people.
Your opinion on 100% FDI in insurance sector?
Yeah, I think I don't know really what the safeguards are, but I think the safeguards are going to be very, very important if you have to allow 100% FDI in the insurance sector. Today, it may, make some sense because in any case, I think the government is not very keen on having public insurance in the LIC as a dominant player. Now, the LIC as a dominant player has been both advantages as well as disadvantages in some ways. They've not been able to give the same savings return. But the reliability of having a LIC to cover the life part, the actual insurance part, is something which we need to look at more closely before opening up.
And also because we have a huge population, our country would be all the other like foreign investors, foreign insurance providers, be very eager to participate in our kind of, because this like population is huge. So even if there are small premiums, the total kind of
Yeah, see, my point though is that the FDI and private insurance companies may not be willing to pick certain vulnerable sectors. Okay? Certain kinds of farming, okay, selective farming may actually happen. Today, with a lot of data being churned by using advanced data techniques, I should be able to pinpoint, which groups are vulnerable, who are likely to die, and so on and so forth. And that data is out there swimming. We just need to collect that. But the private guys, and particularly the foreign guys, would be first on it, and they'll be able to cherry pick the markets. And that may not be good for covering the insurance of the poor. So that load will fall on the government. So it may have been not a very efficient solution to have an LIC, but it's still a better solution than keeping a free market of this kind.
next question is that government estimates government continues to do poorly with regards to the disease management, kind of a shortfall about 35% in spite of having a very modest target. So they have an infrastructure, they have a ministry, but actually it is job of a deputy secretary because ultimately you are having a very modest target and also underachieving by 35%. So at the same time, the share of capex is going down. So limited ability of the government of India to execute a larger public investment program. So government has done away with the heavy lifting with regards to the capex, and this investment is not happening that much. So is it a thing of worry or?
See, you can take a very right-wing, classical kind of position and say that all the public sector should be privatized, and but if you follow through with that, you have to come clean as well. The other position is that let's keep the public sector and use it for developmental purpose, for leadership, for give them autonomy. Now, there is no reason why, if the Indian public sector is given the autonomy, that it would not be accountable. In fact, wherever Indian public sector has had real autonomy, in NTPC and ISRO, PHEL for quite some time, till its autonomy evaporated. And there are very few actually. They have done exceedingly well. The entire industrialization of East Asia runs on public sector, not just of China, Korea, Taiwan. So that strategic role which the public sector can bring is extraordinarily important. However, what is actually happening is there is neither a complete privatization nor a enhanced positive role for the public sector. So the public sector is caught under this government more so than in the previous government. Not that the previous government did this, but in a kind of nowhere land, and they are being destroyed systematically, and so on. So that some have alleged that the public sector is being destroyed, brought down to steel, Vizag Steel, DSNL, telecom companies, possibly the oil companies, the coal mining companies. So to a point where they can be bought off cheaply by a waiting rent-seeking private sector. And that is what is driving the sector. So the government doesn't want to privatize the honest way, which would be to set up a public disinvestment commission, because India is after all a democracy. Give it complete autonomy, because there is a strategy involved. I mean, if you do it like this, if I privatize first this company and then the other, the overall value realization is high. If I do it the other way around, then it may be low. So there is a interaction, talking to the market, kind of teasing the market up to respond to these kind of things, which is not being.
Is it reached a kind of a saturation level?
No, not at all. Not at all. And first of all, you need to create this independent, autonomous body, which can be, kind of headed by very fine people that there are, by teams, which can be put together. But the key thing is to give it the autonomy.
So regarding this autonomy, there is a proposal, not like overall, there is a proposal in the budget that talks about establishing a high-level committee for regulatory reform
I'll come to that, but first consider this privatization. So what has actually happened is very interesting. Okay? But today, the dividend pressure on the public sector is the highest, and it has been really raised to a remarkable height by the current government. So much so that the public sector has nothing to invest. And the private sector cannot jump into those areas either with that kind of gusto because they are there. Right? So what it means is huge underinvestment, sir. Because you're not allowing the public sector, you're squeezing them. You're squeezing them bone dry to a point where their values can even. So the dividend pressure is so high that whether or not they make money, you're asking. What kind of
So there is a huge mismanagement of public.
Yes, and workers are protesting in so many of these public sectors. But that's not the point. The point is that from the point of view of India, is this what you do? So I would appreciate a wholesale privatization. Again, the government has defined privatization as strategic. Why should an Indian oil be strategically sold off to some private party, foreign or domestic? Why can't you just dilute its shareholding? Yeah, dilute its shareholding till it comes below 50%. The management is excellent. So is the case with a large number of things.
These are called Navaratna sources.
Right. So you bring down the government shareholding so that the government cannot interfere, okay, and needle them, prevent them, and they can run free. They can be very competitive in global markets. So there is that kind of a divestment which comes from dilution, which is very, very awesome.
In telecom, suppose BSNL or MTNL were kind of continuously like they were mismanaged in such a manner that private telecom they benefited out.
Oh, not just that, they were literally arm twisted to not compete. For instance, BSNL laid a 5-pair copper to every house maybe 15 years back. They were not allowed to use that. So that entire money went waste. So there are such things, Air India till it was privatized was not allowed proper rules. So of course, let me first say that the government did well by privatizing it, which is a great achievement. But there is no follow through. Now, so why does the government keep it like that? If I were to make a guess, it would be that it has opened the hornet's nest in terms of the ability to make silently money in Islam, which I'm not saying that the government makes it, but many other people who are in the know of what the government would do can make it. There's a huge hue and cry in the market that all these are going to be privatized stock markets. Boom. The stock prices boom. Then there's a saying that, we don't intend it, it falls. So if I'm in privy to that information, I can make money both ways. So I'm not so sure that this is not happening. So I can't ever prove that.
So in this context, this talk about establishing a high-level committee for regulatory kind of reform.
Yeah,
you are talking about such reform for long. So is it a kind of just a lip service or they are serious?
I think the government is serious about it. But my point is there sufficient wisdom within the government leadership
to run it?
To come out with the right. Many high-level committees have made inane, recommendations like transport coordination can be brought about by slapping all the transport ministries, road, air, shipping, city transport under one. That happens. No. Okay. So the point is, I'm not very sure that such a committee, unless the government really searches for people who have the right knowledge and information, okay, that this is going to come out with anything particularly meaningful. Because the problem of regulation is something which, is the problems in regulation, the incentive incompatibilities, compatibilities, and the kind of, the endogenous risk which is there in contracts and so on, are completely alien to the bureaucracy. I don't think if the government limits itself to the bureaucracy, it will ever come up with, a wise man's report.
So it's my last question before we open up for the audience. Like it is not directly related to the budget as such, but I can't resist asking you this question: is that why faster growing India's growth rate is faster than China, but still it generates only 1/3 of China's income? Like average Chinese is 4 times richer than Indians, even though last few years India is growing higher than China. So what's?
So that's simple. I mean, China has grown at a furious pace of around 9.5% to 10%.
1980 we were almost similar.
Yeah, actually 1975 to be more precise, India may have been higher in per capita income than China. As late as the mid-80s, the Indian car market was higher than that of China, and India's trade was comparable to that of China. But China grew systematically.
And that was pre-liberalization period.
Well, for us it was pre-liberalization, but for them the liberalization was 39. And since then, they have not really looked back. They maintained a growth rate of, let's say, 9.5 to 10.5% all the way till 2016. So this kind of high-speed continuous run over these decades pushed China out of poverty to the ranks of the middle income and within striking distance of being advanced. This is one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century because something like maybe 700 million people escaped poverty and came able to deal with it. So if you look back at that, it's not just based on authority. It's based on getting the right policy, getting particularly the right trade and investment. So that we're not looking at. Unfortunately, hardly any of us look toward these things. So the point is, China is of course much richer. In fact, its per capita income may not be just 4 times, maybe even higher than that. India, its PPP is today being underestimated. PPP terms, I think the factor is still in PPP terms already China is much richer than, much bigger than the US. In perhaps even in exchange rate terms, it is confused.
So now we open up the question from the audience. Both, like I think there is a question. Please identify yourself, just your name.
Hi, my name is Chavan. I'm from PGPT. So my question is, government is considering to make MSME sector as their second engine after the agricultural sector. So can you please put some light on this particular MSME sector's growth? And my second question is, you were discussing about inflation for this thing. So my second question is, since we all know that there is the deposits in the banks are a bit lower in last 10-15 years, I don't know the exact figures. And what are your expectation for upcoming rate cut or 7 Feb's this thing?
So on MSME, on MSMEs, you kind of related particularly to this now. Yeah, and if I kind of take you back a little bit, there were 3 things which really hit MSMEs, and they are all interrelated. Whether they should or should not have been hit is a different question. The first thing that hit the MSMEs was, I would think, GST. Because what GST does is it makes everybody pay the tax. So there is no escape. Okay? A lot of the MSME activities were based on the possibility of evading tax. Okay. So obviously those MSMEs will now be on the back foot, and the advantage that the larger units would have in terms of scale and quality and so on would shift activity from MSMEs to larger ones. But there is also another issue which is often not recognized, which is that when you put an interest rate tightening on the market, okay, and what we say, that when the domestic credit is crunched, when DC is crunched, instead of both NFA and DC to kind of achieve lower inflation, if you're doing inflation targeting, then those who are dependent on bank funds find a severe credit squeeze as much, unlike those who are dependent on a broader portfolio of funds which can be raised in the market. The MSMEs cannot raise funds in the market. If you let them raise, they'll rip you. Okay. So the point is, this kind of a credit squeeze is the second factor. A third one, which has often been the case, and it goes well beyond this government's regime, that means it goes into 2000s, early 2000s as well, if not even early, is that the tariff regimes in India have been inverted. Many, many years. That means the final stages usually have a lower tariff than the intermediate stages or the input industries. So a lot of manufacturing, which depended on hand, assembly, and so on, was discouraged. The best example is electronics. Through an inverted tariff, we literally threw out an electronics industry, which of course, much later the Chinese, Koreans, and so on picked up. So the point is, MSMEs being focused on manufacturing, the inverted duties affect them severely. Okay? Interest rates affect them severely. Okay? And the other is what I said, the GST. So the lack of, or the tax evasion kind of gave them some space. Okay? Now the tax evasion has come down. Interest rates are way above what is competitive elsewhere in the world. For instance, the Chinese Fisher Open, that means the uncovered parity, difference is only about 1–1.5%. In India, it's about 4%. That means there is a 2% excess interest rate, and therefore that will hurt the MSMEs much more than this. So these are the broad macro factors. There's of course reservation which had to go and which went quite some time back. Okay? Now the government's focus is always in terms of talking about MSMEs, IT initiatives, digitization, and that sort of thing, without addressing these three issues. Okay? There is quite a significant address on the credit side. Okay? So today, a large industry, and that's thanks to this government, cannot delay the payments to an MSME, to a registered. And that's a good thing. Earlier, they were subject to that squeeze as well. But ultimately, I think it's a point that if manufacturing can get a real big boost in India through a variety of instruments, then MSMEs, you don't need to do anything. They will prosper. Coming to the second, what was your second question? Can you please repeat your second question? Sorry.
So we are having deposits very low since last 10–15 years. So this is making the borrowing cost a bit higher than what it is supposed to be, and government is trying to add some liquidity to the market. So what is your take on the upcoming rate cut, or will you be expecting any rate cut in the...
Oh, will I be expecting? See, I really don't know. But my sense is that a rate cut should happen. Because if we don't, then the growth rate, which we have projected at 6, may not happen. And so the rate cut should happen because the inflation is already very low if you go by the code. Okay? But it doesn't exclude a sudden rise in the overall inflation because tomato is gone. Because government has refused to, the government raises the tax on oil. Or let's say global prices on oil goes up and government doesn't positively compensate by reducing the duties. So all of that can happen. And the RBI responds to all of that. It's funny. Remember, the RBI even responded to a house price increase, which was entirely fictional because of the 7th Pay Commission, and put a dastardly cut on demand by increasing the interest rates. So we don't know. So I don't know. But the RBI is known to be fairly conservative. And this RBI, I don't know. Most of the people within the RBI are fairly conservative. So they will probably watch the global interest rates. The US delays, then my sense is that India would also. So it depends more on Jerome.
So we take a question from online. I believe Professor Divya has a question.
Yeah.
If you can.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Morris. From gender budgeting point of view, what is your opinion? Because it is being said that this is one of the largest budget in terms of gender budgeting. There is an increase, but I am not an expert, but when I closely looked at the part-wise allocation, the part A, which talks about the 100% allocation, is actually stagnant for last 4 or 5 years. So which means we are not, maybe thinking about, and at the same time, if you look at the recent gender gap report 2024, India is still at 129th position out of 146 countries. So are we doing enough with regard to what is currently needed? So your thoughts.
See, I have a certain sympathy for the government on this matter because okay, but before that, let's look at this gender budgeting issue. So there are two issues out here. One is the government has been making fairly large relative to last year provisions, but it has typically underspent. Okay. So I'm not very sure that it will be able to spend even the current provisions which have been made. And now there are various reasons for it. But before that, what is gender budgeting is a little bit more complicated than what we would tend to believe. That kind of cursory kind of look would tell us. See, what the government does is it has its spending on the usual items. Okay, so there are departmental spendings. So there's an economic and functional classification of the budget. So the economic is in terms of purpose, and the functional is in terms of purpose, and the economic, I think, is if I'm not mistaken, in terms of salaries, assets, and so on. So there's a two-way classification. Now you can actually do a third way also, which is to say that, okay, here is a project which is going to develop tribals. And since 50% of tribals are women, I take that budget and allocate 50% for gender. So it's very notional. So one has to go deeper into it. Unfortunately, I haven't done that. So I can't tell you how serious the government is to the budget to solve gender-related issues. But I think the gender-related issues are much more of a social kind, where, let's say, education, changes in perspectives, mass movements and so on can help, okay, rather than just allocating a budget for it. But if there is a budget for, let's say, schools, and there is no discrimination against women or girls, then that's one of the best things that can happen. So schools, so there is a need to focus on schools. But as you know, school quality has been coming down as illustrated by the capability of students through the ACR, which I think our institute has been involved in that. Okay, so the point is, what about schools? I mean, what about their quality? So here one sees a massive casteism. That those who are in rural, poorer, urban, slum areas and so on, the kind of schools that they can access are government schools or rip-off private schools. And these are hugely under-equipped, and practically very little learning takes place there. Whereas the elite schools, to which, let's say, your children and my children can go to, are very well. Nowhere in the world would you find this kind of a hiatus or a huge gap between one segment of government public school and another segment of public school. If you look at the US, China, Japan, and so on, there is no such thing. And the government is doing mere tokenism here. It just wants to increase the enrollment, which it has done. It wants to say that if there is a school everywhere, but the quality is dismal. So wherever there's a quality issue in public service, the government fails dramatically in addressing the access, so the well-being of the poor and the remote. So healthcare, education, these are among the worst in India because there is a quality issue. The government is unable to manage the issue. So my point is, when it comes to gender, it's a very important thing. But the budget, in that direct sense in which the government is trying to say, hey, I have increased the budget for gender by 100%, doesn't mean that the government is key. It's doing what one would say flag waving and
there is a question from the audience here. Please keep the mic.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for the analysis. This is Rahul from healthcare first year. So you mentioned that the government has focused more on the supply side of things, and by that, I think it refers to initiatives such as Make in India, or initiatives that would focus more on corporate. However, you said that the focus has not been on the demand side. I want to understand what would be those initiatives, and can we hold state governments more accountable for that? And by allocating, let's say, increasing the share of funds that are given to the state government, can we sort of solve this problem?
Yeah, see, when you say demand side, okay, there is a very major and I think a positive supply side initiative, which is the PLI. The old idea of the PLI was much better than the current. Okay? So currently the PLI goes to even, let us say, me too, serve me too interests. Okay? So I am an industry, he has got it, why am I not getting it? Okay? Whereas the PLI was originally intended only to go to certain industries with great leverage in terms of growth or great leverage in terms of technological and catching up to China, which I think was a very good idea. But let's come to demand. You see, if you look at one of the lasting features in the Indian system, which goes all the way back to almost independence, is that the export profitability has always been lower than the domestic sale profitability. Whereas for the whole of East Asia, the export sale profitability is always higher than the domestic, was always higher than the domestic sale. So they had export-led growth. How they did that is a more complicated question. I don't want to get into it. But if you accept this, that in India it has always been the reverse of what it has been, there, this huge global market, which awaits us and our industry, goes virtually untapped. So India's share of trade has risen from 1%, fell from the 50s, when it was about 2-3% to about less than 1%. And it has slowly climbed back to maybe about 1.5%. That's the only achievement. But remember, most of the world now is richer than India. So therefore, the demand side for Indian products, and we are the cheapest guys in the world. Okay? So if we can't manufacture for the rest of the world, there must be something seriously wrong. And one thing is that the local profitability is still higher than international profitability. Now, if you look at the government's own pricing, particularly of administered products, be they electricity, water, infrastructure services, they are at rip-off prices because the entire water revenue comes from the industry. Okay. The electricity charge for industry is about 2.5 times their cost to serve. Okay. Now, with these kind of debilities, Indian industry is not competitive, even though it could have been. So if you remove these, if you zero VAT, all taxes which are put on industry, and you also put administered prices, I mean those inputs which are administered prices on a tax basis, so that you can zero VAT it, India's competitiveness can be realized. Okay? And of course, on the exchange rate side, there is a bigger story. India's exchange rates have never been aggressive; they have been classical. So in a textbook fashion, they are right. But if you look at the East Asian exchange rates, they have not been classical. They have been aggressive. Okay. So the whole world of academia is wrong and Trump is right when he says that exchange rates matter, when he says that tariffs matter. Okay. So the point is, in a more involved model, you can actually show it. Okay. See, for instance, when India exports to the rest of the world, its cost of production on the labor side is zero. Social cost, because there is idle labor. So even if it dumps these products at very cheap rates, India will benefit and the rest of the world will also. That was Chinese strategy. Till they absorbed all their labor. After that, they don't have that space. Today, India is the only country which has that space, and there is wonderful entrepreneurship in India. But there is no strategic thinking either on the part of the RBI or on the part of the government. Okay. So this will involve relearning from the textbooks to something where you actually look at the success stories. So my point is, when I say the demand side is not being addressed, I mean all of this. You're creating tax and other kinds of distortions which make them less competitive. You're inverting the tariff, okay, which again makes them non-competitive. And then you're putting very high costs through both interest rates as well as the exchange rates, which don't make them. Now, some part will lie with the RBI and the general economic thinking. Some part will lie with the government.
I also have some, I can add to Sir's what Professor Morris said. So, suppose I did as a part of an NITI Aayog at the project, I did a kind of a
employment generation kind of a forecasting thing. So they are not only manufacturing, but like the government always focuses on certain labor intensive manufacturing like leather, textile, that things. But the employment elasticity is very high in service sectors like healthcare, like education, like rural development. But that is where the underspending is happening. So actually, if we spend more on education, more on healthcare, more on rural development, that will ultimately create lot of jobs also. And those would be a kind of new entrant to the job market, and and that will have a huge impact on the demand side. So that is not the area we are not tapping that area. Okay, really, like giving exemption regarding the tax is good. Like we are all beneficiary of it. But thing is that there are a huge population whose real wages are stagnant or declining. So they are also consumers. So if they get into the into jobs through expenditure on education, healthcare, rural development, in such areas, that will be a huge demand side. But somehow that is not. It's not only certain manufacturing that creates jobs, but this service sector creates a lot of jobs.
I mean, I'm sure that the union budget plays a role, but shouldn't the states also be more involved?
You are saying these are all mostly state subjects.
Like, for example, health is a state subject.
Well, it's not. Yeah, I agree with that. Health, education are, and if you really look at it, there is a vast difference between some state governments versus others. For instance, Goa on basic healthcare, basic education, Kerala, Karnataka are much better than the Bimaru states. But having said that, there is a larger problem. The larger problem is that there is a glass ceiling which is created because of the center, because we are a part of the union. Okay. See, for instance, there is migration. So if you take average health levels and average education levels of Goa, and if you limit it to those who are registered, domiciled in Goa, it will show a very high level. But if you were to include a fairly large number of migrant labor, it will show very poor results. It will fall significantly. Now, what is Goa? Does it not include the migrant labor? It's the whole question. So my point is that state governments are not governments the way let's say the Korean government is different from the Chinese government. So states are only part. They are going increasingly towards what one would say a centralized system. Okay. And it was anyway a unitary system. So the federal aspect is what keeps it going. Now, let's take one thing. So the central government makes huge amounts of money available through the what I would say first of all, there is the fiscal transfers through the finance commission. And then there are spending or over and above. Now, if you look at the finance commission, it has significantly been giving more revenue to the poorest states. Okay. And similarly, the spending has been by the central government has been skewed towards the poorer states, but also today is skewed in a very political way. For instance, Bihar today is getting much of the discretionary government spending. You can see that in the budget itself. Now, one is not saying that the government should not. The Chinese have seen the largest fiscal transfers ever in the world. But the point is, it must be win-win. It cannot be lose-lose. Whereas the way it's done today, it's lose-lose. So when a Maharashtra or when a Karnataka gives up so much money and it goes to Bihar, it at best supports Bihari consumption. And that also of the thin elite who can grab from the government. Okay. You can realize rents from the government, not necessarily the very poor. Whereas in China, that kind of fiscal transfer leads to faster growth of the depressed area, so that the richer area can now, address those, can interlink, in a more functional and a positive. So this is one of the major problems in fiscal transfers. In India, many people have faced this, but it has gone nowhere. Okay. Now, Yeah, so you get the point that state governments are constrained beyond a point. See, a state can only grow if the nation grows. Because a lot of the demand for the state comes from the rest of the country. So if let's say, I remember under Chandrababu Naidu, he wanted to push towards a 12% growth. We did the visioning for that. Now the point is a 12% growth for Andhra would have been possible if the nation as a whole grew at 9. It can't be independent of that. So there is massive coherence between the growth rates and overall demand set by the RBI and by monetary and fiscal policy.
Is there any other question?
There was a question from the chat box that is about migrant labor and what about this informal sector, migrant labor, and what does the budget do for it? The budget does many things. For instance, it creates a register. All migrant labor are supposed to be handled through a register, okay, which is an online register. So you go register and then wait for God to deal with you. If you don't register,
that is the Ishroom portal you are talking.
That's all. So that was announced, I think, 2 years back,
and
it still continues to be announced. Now, there's a fundamentally, I think, flawed understanding of the role of migrant labor. And the attention, though, began to increase with the COVID when we saw these hordes and hordes of people walking, cycling, etc., back to their homes. It came as a big surprise to most state governments, particularly the state governments which were from their origination. So it was a surprise to Orissa, Bengal, and Bihar governments that so many of their people were actually. So, see, India is one nation, sure, but it also has subnational. So beyond a point, the tolerance of, let us say, Karnataka to outsiders may not be there. So, you'll have to worry about these breakpoints and understand why the hell can't Bihar, Eastern UP and Madhya Pradesh create job opportunities for its people. Okay. So the point is, this migrant labor is such a severe problem. Let's, that you have virtually, my sense is out of every 4 workers, okay, 1 is migrant labor. And you've done the most brutal thing by ensuring that all migrant labor will be separated from their families. Because in the recipient states, there is no recognition of them as local citizens. It's not going to happen that easily unless the sector takes, passes some legislation, ensures certain things. One good thing they did was made the ration accessible. Okay. But there is a lot that can be done. There is a lot. I think the best solution for the people and for labor and for human life and for human dignity is to create many more jobs in UP, Bihar. Now the government, at the political level, realizes, but it's going nowhere on that. A little bit here and there gets blown out of proportion. But that's real challenge. A little bit was done by the previous government, by this government. Intent is even more, and that's something positive, but it's not happening. I would think the major reason for besides the supply side, demand side, and the factors is the uncertainty. See, if the political and policy uncertainties are going to be as large as they are in India, then the investment rate is not going to be at its peak. Even if, let us say, costs of investment, maybe the interest rates fall and the demand side. And this government, by being over enthusiastic and being driven by certain wonky ideas, has created massive uncertainty for investors. I don't mean for people to park their money in the stock market, but for companies which have to spend money to create capital. It's not, let's take the auto sector to be straight. Even as we were transiting into Bharat 6, electric incentives for electric. Not a bad thing. But when you then say that, look, I'm going to plan these, it put the fear of God into the auto sector. The auto sector declined by 25% every year for 2 years. It's only post-COVID that it recovered. Okay. It has still not recovered anywhere close to its old level. So this uncertainty, by too many policy initiatives, same being re-rolled and rolled, suddenly tweaking, something is going on and then you call it back. Umpteen number of missions which have been set in place. All of that creates massive uncertainty without anybody bothering about coherence, placement, and orthogonality between various policies.
So the question has the first part which the participant wants to focus on. That question is that what do you think would be the critical implications of budget upon the very poorly documented activities in the unorganized sectors? So unorganized sectors are unorganized because they are not documented or very poorly documented. So his budget is going to make any difference to that?
Now, if you look at unorganized, okay, there is an unorganized industry. Okay? And then there is unorganized labor, in the sense labor which don't have the same kind of benefits that you and me have, like a permanent job. So today, if you look, a very large part of government, maybe as much as 50%, is run by TEMPs, contract. Okay? And similarly, in the public sector and in the large industry, most people are either a contract or they are TEMPs in the sense that they don't have any permanence. So the problem of, so there is a kind of the distinctions between the unorganized and the organized are beginning to thin. Okay? Similarly, wage rates are also wage rate differences are also beginning to thin. So that 8 times differential between a worker, let's say a Crompton Greaves in the 80s, who did a certain job and the same job being done in Kurla next door, that is no longer there. Okay? It's still only about 2 or 5, maybe about twice or 1.5 times or 3 times max difference. Okay? So the point I'm trying to make is that the labor force cannot anymore be considered as something that stands in the way of India's prosperity. Okay? That used to be the case in the 70s and 80s. Okay? Labor movements, strong labor movements, which kind of, did not give the rights to the foreman to manage the shop floor. All that is gone. So labor is not an anti-growth force anymore. It is government, its uncertainties, its inability to think through, and of course the demand side to be particularly. It's not again the private sector and its investment.
So there is another question. What is your opinion on allocation to environmental sector and sustainability concerns? Kindly.
Yeah, so allocations are there. There's a fairly large allocation to the petroleum sector, which I guess is for meeting green targets. Okay, I've not really looked at the budget in that greater detail to figure out what the targets are on green. We have a very strong commitment which goes beyond the budget for greening the electricity production. So all of that is good, but it comes at a significantly higher cost, which goes unnoticed. For instance, if you take, say, Adani's large power plant, solar power plant on the border of Pakistan in Gujarat, Rajasthan, Gujarat, the generated cost of power is very low, but the use cost of that power, given the large transmission and the back down of coal and other stations, is actually very high. So there has to be a rational rather than a knee-jerk, approach to green. And I think our leaders have always shown the tendency of, being more loyal than the king. It means taking on the green agenda well beyond what their shoulders can bear. Now we are able to pull it off because the vast majority of the people are not included in development. But if they demand their inclusion, then India's emissions will necessarily have to go up. Some elements within government do realize this. Okay? But the electricity sector is a good example where by over pushing on green, we have raised the cost of power quite considerably. Okay? Because so much of the thermal is actually backing down. By going further, now of course the court finally has decided the right way, but by insisting on environmentalist pressure, that we must have electrostatic precipitators. And sorry, not just electrostatic, that is required, but trapping of NOxes and SOxes when Indian coal is used. The cost would have gone up quite significantly, but Indian coal does not have anywhere close to the SOxes and NOxes that imported or other coal has. So we have saved a great deal of cost because there has been some marginal realization of rationality. So my point is the green agenda in the current budget is all over the place. Okay, and for instance, an EV, it is there again. One can, while we need to push on the EV, my own assessment is that if the traffic speeds on Indian roads can go up by 5 kilometers per hour, okay, average, then the saving on on carbon emissions will be more than a 10% penetration of the entire vehicle population with EVs. Okay, so there are low-hanging fruits which go unrecognized and unnoticed in this drive, because the ability to think through and coordinate is not something. Think through in a coordinated way is not something which is Government of India's fault, because the way people are, even very good bureaucrats are, they're literally on their feet all the time. It's forever firefighting, and knee-jerk reactions are built into the government, and you can see that in the budget all over, as much as the fickleness of policy as well.
I don't think there are any more questions. Just 1 minute I will take to add to that labor issues, that unorganized sectors, unorganized workers, or undocumented, unorganized activities. Like the problem in India is that even the formal sector, organized sector, their share of unorganized labor is going up through contractualization, through outsourcing, and other things. So suppose, I give an example. Suppose Bata India is suppose 35 years back, suppose having a proportion of 80% of their workers are regular workers and 20% contractual. Now it is just opposite. It has become the opposite. Now 80% are contract workers and 20% are regular workers. And why this contractualization, why this informalization within the organized sector happens? Because it reduces the cost. So its profitability goes. Your export competitiveness that Professor Morris was talking about. You have cheap labor, utilize those and export. So, but that will have an impact on the demand side again, because if you see the profit has gone up 4 times and real wage stagnating, and profit share is going up and the wage share is going down, that will be having an impact on the aggregate demand. So there is the other side. So I think that side is not being addressed, not only by this budget, like for long this is not being addressed. So that these issues are being raised, but I have never seen being addressed in that. So you're just looking at labor as input in the production function and try to minimize the cost to the highest extent possible. But they are also your consumers. So there the backlash comes.
Yeah, I thought I'll just mention this point because it's so glaring, but has gone unnoticed in the discussions in the popular media. Okay, the economic survey says, based on a kind of projection of the pre-COVID, data, whether or not we have reached the trend line. And if you actually look at it, the analysis is wrong. Okay, the analysis is wrong because what the economic survey does is it takes the pre-COVID data, let's say on manufacturing GDP, as it is and linearly projects it forward. Okay, and then it looks at the actual manufacturing output. These are deseasonalized and then sees whether it has climbed up to that level. In this case, for instance, the conclusion is that it has come very close to it. Okay, which is the blue line. The blue line is the economic survey's forward projection. And if you look at the red line, which is the reality and manufacturing, then it has come fairly close. But it hasn't, because GDP and all output indicators will grow exponentially. They don't add a constant number each year. They had a constant rate of growth. That's the expectation. So if you put an exponential trend to it, then you get the green line. And if you get the green line, okay, then the gap between, so the economic survey is quite wrong. When you find the gap between the green line and the red line, that tells you, whether you have reached the trend line or not what the economic survey claims. Okay. Now, if I use the actual correct way and work it back, then actually one can work out the employment loss in not, reaching the levels. Okay. So let me just try and give you that. Yeah. So here is a picture. So in manufacturing, there's 1.67 million full-time jobs which have been lost, approximately. Now, how does one estimate? Take the GDP gap between manufacturing as realized, as should have been the case, has had the pre-COVID trend been maintained, and the current GDP in manufacturing. Okay. Assume that something like 2/3 of it is value added for workers. Okay. And then assume that workers get 6 lakhs a year. One unit of employment on 6 lakhs, which is an overestimate. And then divide it and you get 1.67 million full-time jobs deficit. Similarly, if you look at trade, it's 2.6 million full-time jobs deficit. And if you look at finance, it's 1.0 million full-time jobs deficit. So with these kind of deficits, the downward pressure on demand is quite reasonable. Okay. So what one is saying is, not only is the government making mistakes in tweaking data the wrong way, but it's also making bloomers. Okay. And I think that should be avoided, because this is something which should not have missed it. Okay.
I don't think there are any more questions. Thank you very much for your attendance. I'll request Krishel to deliver a vote of thanks, and we conclude this.
So as we come to an end of our discussion of the union budget, I take this opportunity to thank our discussant, Professor Sebastian Morris, for sharing his insights. I also thank our moderator, Professor Kingshuk Sarkar, for delving into the focus of the discussion of the budget. I thank my colleagues, Bernice D'Souza, Shruti Shirodkar, Vaibhav Pavaskar, and Narendra for their valuable assistance to facilitate this discussion. And thank you to all our students, professors, and online participants for dedicating valuable time to be part of this session. Thank you.
We conclude. Thank you very much.